kind of deep dive into what funding is all about and how much you should, secure funding, at what point in time you should raise for funding. These are some of the things that we want to kind of understand today. I would ideally like this to be a more interactive session because, we would like to have your questions and we would like to have the experienced folks over here address them. I have a great panel here, starting with Shirish, and I will speak for Shirish because he's got a bad cold, but I will ask Tushar and uh, Raghu to kind of introduce themselves. For Tushar has done, Shishir has done a couple of exits in the past, and the beauty is that his last two exits were of service companies, and there he has not raised any funding. Right. But he has done, he's doing a product company now called Sapient Analytics, and he's raised some funding on that. And so that's the kind of a very successful entrepreneur that we have. And Tushar, if you can just introduce yourself as to what Healthify does, and then yourself, Raghu, then we'll kick off from there.
Thanks, Rajneesh. Well, some of you may have seen our stall outside. I'm the co-founder of Healthify Me. It's India's first digital fitness product or a company. It comprises of an Android application where you have the world's first Indian calorie counter built in, so you can track all the amazing food you've been having on the buffets. It'll give you the nutrition feedback. It's got nutritionists and trainers on the cloud advising you and assisting you. And our most recently launched feature is this wearable that I'm wearing, which helps track your steps. So it's been about 2 years in making, but we've just sort of we're just at the cusp of seeing significant traction and have a really good product built out. We raised a small seed funding about 18 months ago, and at the middle of our current fundraise process.
Good. So that's the newbie that we have. So we have an experience, we have a newbie, and we have someone who's kind of raising a large amount of tracks of money now. So Raghu, why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, this is Raghu. I'm a co-founder of a company called Taxi for Sure. We are in the business of solving the transportation problems in the city. Right? And yeah, I think probably we'll get to know more about what we do, how we go about doing it, probably during the course of the discussion.
So let me start off with Raghu, with yourself itself. In this market, the market that you're currently in, and it's kind of, I will not say crowded completely, but it's kind of, a lot of noise is being made over there. What made you to kind of, what is the decision point that you had, at which you decided that I have to go for an external funding? And you have raised a series of rounds at this point in time. So what was the various decision points at which you thought of taking the money and the quantum of money that you have taken from the market? I would like to kickstart from that.
Interesting. So when we started 3 years back, right? So we started approaching people when we just had an idea, right? We didn't really have any moving product and things like that. We started approaching investors, and the good part about investors is no one says no on your face right away, right? So you have no idea whether they essentially believe in what you're trying to do, or if they don't believe in what you're trying to do, right? So we spent around 4 to 5 months going in those circles. Right, after that we stopped and we thought, let's focus on building the product, and we started building the product. And since we had engaged in a conversation with the VCs earlier, right, and 4 months later when we had some amount of traction, right, people started believing that, okay, this actually works, right, and things started moving faster after that. And after that what we did was we raised a seed round, right, and post that we had aligned on certain targets, and then after that it was a single point focus of chasing those targets, right. Then after that, once we crossed those targets, then that was the next round of fundraise. So now, we have got X amount of money, we are supposed to reach a particular target. Now what? Then we raised another round, right? And we had a different set of targets, right? It always, the business plan kept on evolving, right? And incidentally, the last 1 year, things are the other way around, right? So earlier, we used to have certain targets. Once you cross the targets, you raise a round. Right. Now it has been more like, okay, the dynamicism in this industry is so high, right? We get to learn a lot more, right? The space that we are operating in, we don't know whether we are at 40-50% of what we are doing, or probably 4-5% of what we can achieve, right? Because of which, whenever there is a new discovery and things like that, right? That's when you essentially go about raising a round than working on with a particular business plan and stuff like that, because the business plan that we had 3 months back is no longer valid. Whatever projections that we had put for the next 2 years, 3 months back, we already achieved it in the last 3 months, right? So those things are not really valid anymore. So now, because of the constant evolving thing, there is a significant need for raising more capital, and that's the way we go about doing it. And there is a significant interest because we are building something great, right? And I mean, we are making profits, we are actually making money. So a lot of people are seeing that business model already in the works, and the kind of growth that we have seen, we never, so 3 years back, if you had asked us whether we would be at the stage where we are 3 years, 3 years from then, I don't think so that would have been the case. Right? As the business starts evolving, as the model starts evolving, there is always a need for more and more capital, and that triggers when to go about raising a fund than a particular business plan, and these are the timelines when which you need to do. Right? And after you raise your Series A or a Series B round, I think the founder's job is only to raise funds. You build a team who can run the business. I think the CEO's job is essentially to always keep in touch with the VCs, the PEs, the hedge funds, and always keep going after raising funds.
We'll come to that. We'll come to those points. But you said you used a word called interesting word called targets, and I want to kind of double down on that because most people would probably confuse with that because utilization of fund is at most important, and that's something with the next round when you go that's going to count. So we'll double down on that. So Tushar, you believe you're on the same boat at this point in time. You're the person of racing. So can you give us your experience on this?
Sure. Look, I think for most of us who are starting up for a very early stage, it's very hard to access many of the lofty VCs that Raghu has had the privilege of being with now. So I think at a very early stage, about 18, 20 months back, all we had was an idea. I think the people who probably will take bet on you and people who sort of bet on us were advisors to the company. So I think one of the earliest jobs that I did, which is similar to how sort of Raghu went by, is sort of started talking to people. But I realized, VCs were definitely sort of way out of my league at that time. So I started talking to people who genuinely understand this domain. I'm a health and fitness product, so people who are in this field of doctors, leading diabetologists, leading cardiologists, people in the medical space. And these are the people who sort of were willing to take that extra risk very easily because they were true passionate believers in the product, saying, okay, you know what, if you need a 50 lakh or if you need a 1 crore, let me get some friends and family and try to get this done. So I think as a very early stage, that probably makes a lot of sense. I think why I think now we believe we are ready to raise money from sort of the financial investors is because, Rajneesh, I believe we have what I sort of like defining as the fundamental business equation is laid out. What we have seen in the last few months is that our average revenue per user, also known as ARPU in the VC industry, and they'll definitely ask you about it, has increased by about 4 to 5x. And whereas our customer acquisition cost, our CAC or CAC, remains a fraction of that. Right? So what I have is a very simple economic model where there's a potential difference between the average revenue per user and the amount I have to spend to acquire the user. And I believe this creates the opportunity for any financial investment to come in and scale this business rapidly to the next round, like to 5x or 10x growth.
Beautiful.
So now that I've reached that sort of, that simple business equation is now defined. Now it's no longer about do you believe in this broad idea or not, but as a financial investor, you can understand it, you can model it. And so that's why I think now is a good time.
Beautiful.
To sort of raise financial.
Beautiful. I like the clarity that he has brought to the table. He's a first-time entrepreneur, but if you have noticed the kind of words that he used to kind of describe as to how the infusion of funds is going to help him, that institutionalizing of business is most important. And if somebody is going to hear that, any VC is going to hear those kind of terms, that means that the entrepreneur is on a very successful path, and that's the reason why I'm very sure he's going to close a large round very soon as well. So Shirish, you're an outlier here. I mean, you heard the other two gentlemen talk about raising funding for their operations, stuff like that. But you did 2 successful exits without even raising a single dime. And now you're the product company. So what are the learning here? I mean, is it that service companies don't need capital and product companies need it? Or what is your mantra that you had in the past?
Yeah. So I think in the services, so if you look at the services model versus the product model, I think there are fundamental differences. So in services, you kind of first get the customer, you get the project, then you start hiring people. So in some sense, revenue is ahead of your cost. You kind of have a contract signed, you have some revenue, in front of you, you start hiring, you start spending, you start earning that revenue. Typically, the pricing to the customer is ahead of what it's going to cost you to deliver those services. So you're always kind of making profit from the beginning. So in effect, in services, you can scale linearly. You can keep adding customers, and therefore you don't in some sense, need a whole lot of capital for growth. That might change if you want to grow very aggressively. But typically, services companies get funded when you have reached a certain size, and then the venture capital is basically to drive your growth even more aggressively. If you look at the product model, it's completely reversed. You have an idea, you are the only one betting on it, you have to go out and build it, you have to validate it through some early customers. So all of that expense and all of that spend is something you have to bear. So at some point, once you have validated it, you need a whole lot more money on marketing and selling in order to propagate that idea and start having more customers. That's when you need funding, because by that time as founders, you have kind of run out of money. And this thing continues as you move forward, because in product space, it's extremely important to start building a hockey curve growth rate where you slowly become the market leader and then preserve your market leadership to continuous innovation. So I think compared to the earlier two speakers, we had a little bit of a different story to tell, in the sense that we never wanted to build a product company. There were 4 co-founders who had built 2 previous companies. We had successful exits. We kind of had made money. We had decided to retire. But we were mentoring a bunch of product companies, and one of them happened to be a company or an idea started by my wife. And it kind of became very interesting. We started showing it around to people. And we thought, we'll just give it away to somebody, because we were not really interested in building a company. But then along came Indian Angel Network, and they said, guys, we think this is a fantastic product. You have to build it. We'll fund you. And we said, we are not interested. We're not interested in the funding. They said, no, you have to take our funding. And we said, no, it takes forever. They said, no, we'll give you a term sheet in 1 week. And they did. Okay, so we closed that round in a month's time. Then they said, you have to become full-time and kind of grow the business. So we started growing the business. We got early traction. We got customers. But then we slowly started running out of money. We went out to VCs, and 2-3 years ago, VCs were only funding mobile companies and e-commerce companies and internet companies. That's it. Nobody was interested in an enterprise product. So along came a customer. So one of our customers, Infobeans, in fact, the director is in the audience today. They said, Shirish, this is a fantastic product, and if you need money, we'll give it to you. We've made a lot of money. We have created an investment fund. We'll give it to you. So we said, okay, great. So we got the second round of funding. Then I think in the last 1.5 years, we picked up huge traction. Our investors say we are the fastest growing enterprise product company ever out of India. We have 4 global 200 companies as our customers, 5 of India's top 10 IT companies as our customers, and so on. So again, one of our earlier Indian Angel Network investors has created one of India's largest fund, the homegrown fund, India-grown fund, called Orias Ventures. And he truly believes in that product. So Rehan Yarkhan, said that now that you have built a pretty significant business in India, it's time to go global and take this to the US. So at this kind of inflection point where you are suddenly headed to a new market, where the cost of doing business is extremely high, that's when you need massively additional money. You can't do it out of your own profits. And that's why we got the last round of funding 2 weeks back of around 45 crores, primarily for growing the business in the US.
Good. I'll allow you to rest for some time now. Thank you. Good. That's a great point that you articulated. So Raghu, let me come back to you on the valuation front. Let's demystify valuation now, because it's been almost the order of the day that people are trying to secure the maximum amount for themselves, and they kind of have a very not so wise sense of valuation. And you're in that same market, where you're seeing a huge amount of money being raised by your competition, and you yourself also have raised. So can you kind of demystify the valuation game for the audience?
So this is the most challenging bit. It's the valuation is not science; it's an art. Right, valuation is an art. Right. So at the seed round and the Series A, right, when typically companies are not making much revenue, right. So then everything is based on what is the projection, right? What is the kind of projection? What is the kind of run rate, right? So, but the major part of the valuation is a function of the kind of team the company has and what is their experience in the sector that they are essentially starting the company. It's the investors' belief in that, right? And after you cross the Series A, Series B stage, when you essentially started making certain amount of revenue, it's a multiple of the revenue. So what people consider as a revenue multiple, right? And it's a function of how much run rate are you guys doing currently, and what is the kind of projection that you have for the next 1 year or the next 2 years and stuff like that, and typically work backwards on the revenue multiple, right? And typically the way you one really goes is has some comparables, right? So this particular sector is very much similar to this sector, or if you operate in an industry where something like that is done in the abroad markets, right? Then you can essentially probably provide that comparable and come to a particular kind of valuation, right? So when you are raising money, right, even though when people talk about valuation, there is two different aspects to it. One is the value of the company, second is the price that someone is ready to pay, right? What people typically confuse is the valuation is the same as the price, right? Valuation is essentially what the company is probably worth at that particular stage. Price is something that someone is willing to pay for that, and most often they're not the same, right? You have probably have multiple VCs on the table. Your valuation of the company is the minimum price that you will typically get. Then essentially it becomes probably a bidding war and stuff like that, right? And if there are no takers, your valuation probably would become the maximum, right? You need to probably have to do that. So there are multiple times flat rounds typically happen even the company has grown, right? So one should not really typically confuse between the valuation and the price, right? So valuation, so in order to determine a price, people have to know what the value of the company is, right? And there are multiple ways to really do that. So people talk about DCF, but I don't think so DCF really works to that extent, right? But it's the price that probably an investor actually pays.
That's a great clarity about across the table. So moving away from valuation now, and Tushar, to yourself, the art of pitching. Now, that's where most of the startups have a problem, and at least Indian startups, we have seen that although right from day one they are made the PowerPoint presentations for the VCs and not for the customers, and sadly that's the case that we see in India, but still the pitching art is completely missing. You know, if you see right from slide 1, you can decipher from slide 2 that it's not going to go anywhere. What is your thought? You're going through the process now, so what is your best practices that you are doing now?
Sure, I think I can definitely say, again, in your first very small seed round, which you're raising from advisors, honestly, you don't really need much of a deck. You don't really need much of a pitch as such. It's really your passion, your conviction that comes across. But at that point, what I was telling is, you're raising from people who are already industry experts, who sort of know this inside out and who believe in you as a person. But as you go to the financial investors, there is definitely some tricks of the trade that I can probably share from my experience. And guys, please do chip in. One, and the most important learning for me in this process has been keep it really simple, right? And once you've kept it simple, take 40% of it off,
It's
and then
called
further
KISS,
simplify. Yeah,
right?
Keep it simple, stupid, right?
Yeah.
It's extremely important, because what I realize is as founders, as entrepreneurs, right, you've got 80 things running in your head about, you've got at least 6 different distribution channel partners in your mind. You've got so many different strategies you want to try out, post the fundraise, etc. But it doesn't help to sort of open out the entire brain in front of the investors, because you, at the end of the day, have that 5 minutes or 20 minutes to really make your case, right, one way or the other. So what I at least found most effective is, I started from like a 30-page deck, and now I'm down to like a less than 10-page deck, right? And honestly, the 10-page deck makes a lot more simple, powerful case. I started from like 4 different channel distribution strategies. I'm down to a single, maybe a secondary distribution strategy, and that's it, right? Because that's the real, and that also shows that you're focused, you know where you want to prioritize, you know where the money is going to be spent at. I started from, I'm an ex-investment banker, so I started from huge detailed financial models, and I'm down to my basic ARPU versus CAC equation that I talked about, because those are the fundamentals that really count. So I think superbly simplifying the process was helpful. And the second point was that practicing really does make it perfect, is something I realized. You should, I think, practice with perhaps your own colleagues first, and then with some advisors. And if possible, even distribute your own investor pool, if you have that privilege, into sort of a tier A, tier B, tier C kind of category. And start from the bottom. So you want to start pitching to investors that you probably don't want to take money from. And you want to end up at the investors that you really want to take the money from. Because trust me, your pitching will improve tremendously in the 6-9 months that it takes to close a round.
Great. So one advice that I always give startups is that start with your family first, your employees second, and then your customers, and then go to the tier 3, tier 2, and tier 1 kind of a VC base that you have. That's something that I always tell the startups. So, and I want to move over to Shirish now. Utilization of funds, very critical, because that's where most of the conversations go flat. And you talked about target earlier. I want to come to you later on, but I want to ask Shirish, how important is that? Is the entire art of utilization of funds in the pitching stage itself? How are you going to drive the clarity there?
Sorry, so funds.
The utilization of the funds. How do you utilize the funds that you secure from VC? The clarity around that. How important is that, and what are your thoughts on that?
So I think it depends on what stage of the business you are in. So for example, when we received the angel funding, the whole focus was on, so at that point we did have our baseline product, we did have some early customers who were interested, but there were a lot of inputs coming in about what the product should be. We had our own vision about how the product needs to evolve. So at that point, a lot of focus was in engineering the product right and getting more and more initial customers to sign up for pilots and start paying for the product. Once we had gotten past that stage and we had a group of 15, 20 small and mid-stage companies using our product, when we got to Series A funding, the requirement was to scale to much larger companies. Okay? At that point, the product was established, but then it became a question of scalability, it became a question of ease of deployment, it became a question of ease of maintenance, and a significant amount of money also started getting into sales, into the sales process, actually reaching out to these customers and selling the product. I think in the third round, since we have picked up enough traction in India, it's very clearly focused on how are you going to build this business in the US. And one of the things we realized about the US is that the sales process is very different from that in India. Unlike in India, I think the US is much more inbound focused, which means you have to spend a whole lot more on marketing, creating awareness of your product, getting those inbound inquiries, and then chasing after them to close those deals. So a significant amount of money. So in the first round, I would say 70, 80% of our money went into engineering. In the second round, it was kind of 50-50. And now the third round, utilization of funds will probably be 70-30 or even 80-20, with 80% being on sales and marketing and 20% to further augment our engineering.
Do you want to add a point on that?
So interesting. See, when you essentially pitching for with the investors, right, you have a business plan that one typically shares, right? And so that becomes a target. Once people put in money, they just want to see that, right? And how the target really helps is essentially give some focus, give some direction to the company. Because as I said, as Sushas mentioned, there are 80 things that is running in the mind of an entrepreneur. If you don't really have the direction and the focus, probably somewhere you would lose out. So at the early stage, probably it really helps. At once you get on to the post Series B, Series C stage, the targets keep shifting. It's a moving goalpost, right? But what one has to really ensure is you are still playing football, right? The goalpost is shifting, you're still playing football, even though, and you have to resist the temptation that it's easy to carry the ball and run. The moment you make a football into a rugby, that's when people get hurt and get injured. And that's when the decline really starts, right? So target has to be there so that there is a focus, and it's always easy for essentially to get the entire team together for that particular target, right? And when you go to the next round of funding, it becomes a significant, you're building so much of credibility about yourself that this were the targets that you were chasing, and this is what you have achieved. And trust me, I think nearly 95 to 98% of the people would have essentially come up with very low targets, and what they would have essentially delivered would be much higher than whatever the targets are. And you feel good. You feel a lot good because a lot of things are not really falling in place, but with the most critical thing fall in place, and you feel really good. And such kind of smaller pressures are very much required in an entrepreneur's life.
Great. I have more questions to ask, but I'll now leave it for the audience to ask any questions that you have to the panel. Yeah, go ahead. Do you have a mic there?
So this question is more of a first time or initial pitch to a VC or an angel. Can you talk a little more about rookie mistakes which you've either experienced personally or other entrepreneurs have, because I know you probably interact with a lot of them. Can you talk about rookie mistakes while pitching to VCs?
I can probably start with that. In the taxi space, right, the space that we are operating on. So when we got the idea, there were no one else in the world who was doing that, right? I think all across the world, everyone started at this more or less the same time. So the worst mistake that we did was we never shared the actual idea with anyone, because we thought that people would copy, right? So we were telling everything else but the core. Right? So people were engaging because everything else also made sense, but they couldn't really figure out what is the thing that really connects. right? And that's essentially what we did. And it went on for a couple of months, 2 months, 3 months and stuff like that, right? Then we realized that, okay, this is not really moving anywhere, and that's when we started sharing idea. We started sharing the idea with the investors, with our friends, with families, with the potential people whom we want to get on board. I think that changed the entire game altogether. And our first round of investment also really came because we shared it with a friend, right, and who essentially knew some people in the VC community, and he put us in touch with them, and that's how the conversation really started. So after that, we shamelessly, even though people are not interested in listening to the idea, we shamelessly go on telling people, this is what we are trying to do, right? And that was a great learning, actually.
I mean, I think that's a great point that he made across. I already talked about the point about simplifying your core idea and having focus in that. I think one other rookie mistake I can talk about is that again, coming from an ex-investment banker standpoint, I was trying to make the entire presentation very sort of, here is where the industry is at, here's where the market is at, here's where the market dynamics are at, and here's where our value proposition really makes sense. Very sort of clinical view of the whole situation. But that's really isn't how it works. I think there's a lot of emotion that is involved, which is there in you, and I think you should take it out. So, I think what works a lot better for me is that, look, this is a problem, and I understand that problem and that pain point extremely well. So identifying and articulating the pain point first, and perhaps bringing in that, how large the market and where it's at later is perhaps a good idea to go with. And if you can personally relate with the pain point, even better. So I had gained 18 kgs of weight when I joined India, and I then went about losing that. And I think having that personal story in there, the emotion around it was helpful.
That's great. Before I go to the next gentleman who wants to ask a question, so one point that you very interestingly brought out, transparency is the key here. You can't bullshit to a VC. Because typically, when you submit a business plan to them, they're not going to just read the business plan, feel good about it, and give you the money. They're going to do hundreds of checks at the background. They're going to talk to their peers. They're going to talk to the partners whom they know who are in the same space, the customers in the same space, and then they're going to take a decision on that. So transparency is the most over here. So you had a question here.
No, just
Sorry, you had a point to make?
Yeah, I think, my experience was very similar to this too. And sometimes you learn from the customers. So we built a product, we went to the customer, and we had this one piece which was unique. Nobody in the world had it. It was very distinctive. It solved a real problem, of productivity at the workplace, which nobody else had solved. But we also felt that in order to sell it, we needed to have task management, which is something everybody is familiar with. And actually 60% of our time and 60% of our effort was in building that module, which everybody in the world is familiar with. And what we found when we went out to customers, let alone VCs, was that nobody would really look at the one severe problem we were solving. They would get distracted by something they were already familiar with. So I remember a meeting where we took the hard decision to drop all those months of effort, drop that module altogether, and a message after that became very sharp, very focused, very distinctive, and I think helped us both with customers and with the VC.
Very nice. You had a point, quick point? Yeah, just
I
quickly,
think-
because we'll have to have a couple
Sure.
of questions more.
I think it helps to paint a picture of your customer. So, and so that it also shows that you really know your customer. I think as an entrepreneur starting, we believe everyone is your customer, and that's a really bad idea, right? So like it helps to me saying, okay, Neeta, 28-year-old with, a BMI of 28, who works in this profession, who sits on such a chair and has such a lifestyle is facing this problem. And here is how this product is going to exactly solve that problem, right? I think having that clarity also really helps, which I didn't have when I started the process, but I do now. I think having customers is a privilege. So if you have some customers and some traction, they will drive sort of who your customer is. Yeah.
Okay, 10 seconds more for you. on
So
the same.
what Rajnish mentioned, right? You need a VC who essentially does all that research behind the company, because once things starts heading south, the people who believe in the basic fundamentals of the business, they are the ones who are going to support, not the ones who would probably put in money because it's too much of excitement, and they are the ones probably who would leave the company when things starts heading south. Just to
Okay,
add to that.
good. Yeah, so India wants to know. One more last question here.
Yeah, I think question for Raghu. When you are approaching to the VC, because you have this solution for taxi for sure, essentially solving the problem of the transportation. So typically VCs will be asking question, do you have any domain knowledge or around that transportation, because you are coming from IT. So how this was the challenge, or how this was solved actually?
So the way we positioned that this as, we were essentially disrupting the personal car market. We were not really solving the taxi market, right? And when you are essentially disrupting the market, the disruption doesn't really come from people who are within the industry, because they are confined within the market norms. So we used that to our advantage, that we don't belong to the industry, because of which we are not confined by the market norms that the industry follows. And that's the reason where we can possibly disrupt the industry. We use our inexperience to our advantage.
Good. I'm showing all the signs here that we are going to end this now. So let me end it. But before I end, I want to summarize quickly for the benefit of the audience. We spoke about timing, at what point in time you need to raise funds. We spoke about utilization of funds. We spoke about the pitching, the art of pitching, and how you should go about it. And lastly, we also spoke about the fact that how do you bring transparency to the table when you're starting to pitch into the VCs. So in this half an hour, this is all we could cover, but the gentlemen are here. In case you have any more doubts, please reach out to them. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.